Chaos Corrupted Sisters of Battle are something I've been meaning to tackle for a while now, and I sort of did it in a live stream about a year ago. However, after being fortunate enough to receive an advanced copy of Kill Team Chalnath from Games Workshop, I found the new Sisters of Battle miniatures inside to be perfect for my needs. In this video, I'll be showing you how to kitbash and paint a Sister of SLAANESH, and I'll be giving it a dead animal bit rating of 2 dead animal bits out of 5. Now to begin, I simply removed all the parts required to build one of the Noviates, before cleaning the parts up of any mold lines and sprue tabs. These Noviates are kind of like the equivalent to Space Marine Scouts, and like the Scouts, feature less armor. This makes them perfect for mixing and matching with other less heavily armored kits. But before I could use them, I first needed to clean them of any obviously Imperial symbols. A couple of these were on each of the shoulder pads, and to remove them, I started out with my knife to shave away a few of the chunks. With most of the symbol removed, I could use a polishing action by holding the blade perpendicular against the surface and using a scraping motion. This removes any remaining chunks of plastic and smooths out the surface, creating a plain shoulder pad. This process was then repeated to remove the Inquisition symbol from the tabard. So, I kind of made a mistake at this point. The Novitate heads come pre-sculpted onto the torso, and you just glue the visible part of the face to them. I wanted to replace the human face with one from a demonette, but I thought I could just remove the demon's face and glue that into place. Well, after some cutting and trimming, I managed to do this, but now the shape of the head looked wrong, so I came back later on and resculpted the top of the head with some green stuff. But it still didn't look right, so I decided to double down and superglue a demonette's ponytail to the top, which resulted in this thing. In short, I wasn't happy with it, but I didn't admit it to myself until I'd pretty much finished the build, so I had to go back and redo the head, which will cause a bit of discrepancy in the footage so I apologise. So, fast forwarding to the future, I cut away the old face and cleaned up the surface. Onto this, I would be attaching another demonette head, but instead of just keeping the face, I decided to keep the front and top of the head. But to join the two, I first needed to clip a step into the demonette's head so that the neck was removed. This was then tidied up with a knife. After the first clip, I made a comparison against the head and could see that I still needed to make a few trims to both the demonette head and the Novitate head. This process was repeated until the head was fitting properly, at which point I glued it into place. Back in the past, who knew a conversion guide would be so chronologically confusing, I glued the torso together and attached the legs to it. Continuing with the demonette theme, I grabbed one of the smaller clawed arms and checked this against the space beneath the right shoulder pad. It was mostly fitting already, but just required a few small trims before it was ready to be glued to the torso. For the right arm, I used one of the pistol-toting arms from the Novitate kit. I still wanted this model to be usable as a Sister of Battle, at least rules-wise, so I tried to keep the weapon options vaguely correct. If I'd chosen to use an autogun or bolter here, I would have instead forgone using the demonette claw and relied more on the head alone to get across the mutated appearance. There are a whole ton of great SLAANESH kits out there where you can source some interesting extra bits to help add to the God of Excess theme. I personally chose to use one of the armoured shoulder pads from the Hellstriders kit. Upon initial comparison, the pad wasn't quite fitting right, so I made my trims and comparisons, and once the pad was fitting more comfortably over the left shoulder, I glued it into place. Now, if we ignore the whole redoing the head part of this debacle, then this conversion was done, and I could move on to the base. I kept the basing pretty simple here, and started out by gluing the model to the base. This was followed up by tearing up some pieces of my ever-useful cork floor tiles. These can be easily ripped up into rough shapes that work perfectly as small rocks when they're superglued to the base. To finish things off, I filled in all of the empty space on the base using some Vallejo textured paste. Leave this to dry for at least an hour or so before moving on to the painting. I started painting with a black-brown primer. This was applied through my airbrush and with just a little flow improver mixed in to allow the paint through the nozzle. This primer not only gave me a better surface to apply my paint to, but it also provided me with this dark starting colour that I could use to build up my shading from. After priming, my first focus was on the light skin tone and the cloth areas. I wanted to create a nice smooth transition from the dark black-brown primer to a paler colour, so I started off with a 50-50 mixture of black-brown and olive flesh. This mixture was applied through my airbrush along with a few drops of thinner. Here I targeted the upper legs, tabard, head and hair, essentially where you would expect light to naturally fall. This created shading in the recesses and was further built upon by adding just a little bit more olive flesh into the original mixture. This created a roughly 30% black brown to 70% olive flesh mix and was applied over a slightly smaller area than the previous mixture was. This helped to smooth out the transitions between the pure black brown in the recesses and those lighter points. For this model, I wanted to keep the scheme fairly straightforward. I wanted to go for a really desaturated look with the exception of a purple accent colour. This purple was added by taking some dark purple and thinning it out heavily with some regular water to create a glaze. This was then applied over the fabric areas of the model. The thin mixture applied really easily, and because it was translucent, the previously achieved shading was retained. I allowed this first layer to dry, then added a couple more to really build up the intensity. For the next step, I mixed some purple into the previous dark purple to create a shade that lay between the two. This was also thinned out into a glaze. With this lighter paint, I painted over the same parts as before, but reduced the area that I covered. I kept the more recessed areas as the original purple and instead focused on more raised areas and folds in the cloth. Continuing the glazing process, I then moved on to a pure purple. This was focused to an even smaller area than before, so that those prominent folds in the cloth were made even brighter. I finish off the fabric with some small dots of magenta. I carefully place these onto just the corners of the hard edges. This really helped those details to stand out and helped to add a bit of depth to the detail. With the fabric complete, I moved onto the skin. This was painted in an identical method to the fabric, but I started out with a mixture of olive flesh and transparent purple. I use this over the claw, face and upper legs. Now these would normally be painted as fabric, but I felt that painting them as skin would feed into that SLAANESH theme. Like before, I used a glazing method to steadily build up the colour, letting each layer dry before adding more. Once I was happy with the first colour, I added more olive flesh into my previous mix and continued to apply it over the skin, but reduced my area of focus, limiting it to more of the details. The final highlights of the skin were achieved with some regular olive flesh, picking out only the most prominent of details and used very sparingly. I also used this to highlight the strands of the hair. I'd already given them a base coat with the airbrush, but this just really helped them to stand out. The remaining areas included the armour, the equipment and leather details, and these were all base coated with coal black. I thinned out my mixture here, but not quite as much as I had done with the earlier glazes. This was done just to help the flow of the paint across the surface. I also used this to carefully block out the eyes with a pure black. I then highlighted these areas with a mixture of coal black and pale yellow, which mixed to create this warm grey tone. Purple is typically a cold colour, so using warmer tones will help them to contrast against each other a little more. I tackled all the areas from the previous step here with the exception of the parts that I intended to paint with silver. Once the edges had been highlighted, I then added a little more pale yellow into my mix and then used this to just pick out the corners of the hard edges. Finally, I then used some dark silver to paint all the metal parts of the model. Just be careful with this step as you don't want to accidentally overspill onto those areas you've already painted, especially when you're painting the buttons on the tabard. With the model completed, I could begin to work on the base. I began with a base coat of dark umber, thinning it out with a little water to allow it to flow into all of those small and intricate details. This was then followed up with a dry brush of dark umber and pale yellow, which resulted in this light brown colour. To dry brush, take one of your larger brushes, dip it into the paint and wipe away the excess. Then, when you lightly drag this over a highly textured surface, such as the base, it will only accumulate onto those raised details, which really helps them to stand out. This was then followed up with another dry brush of dark umber and pale yellow, but with just a bit more pale yellow mixed in. To help unify the tones on the base a little, I watered down some transparent brown and painted this over the whole of the base. Then, to finish up, I painted the rim of the base black and hit everything with some matte varnish to seal in the paintwork. Finally, a tuft of grass was superglued into place, which completed the model, and left me with this. And here we have the completed Sister of SLAANESH. I wanted to keep things fairly simple with this particular miniature and even lean on some of the painting to help sell that demonette possessed style. This makes it much easier to apply across a whole unit and even across a whole army. So if you enjoyed this conversion and would like to see me tackle a full kill team of these Sisters of SLAANESH, or if you'd like to see me tackle some of the other gods instead, then do let me know. I'll include all the paints used in this guide in the description, along with some affiliate links, so if you're looking to try out some of these things for yourself while supporting me in the process, I would be extremely grateful. Speaking of which, let me say a huge thank you to my ever generous supporters. Currently, my top supporters on Patreon are Jonathan Hart, Berserker, Daniel Dowling, Dakota the Destroyer, Jake, Jeremy Kaup, Jesse Smith, Casper Lindberg, Lyconian Primarch, Merrick, Mr. Grimm, Swedsman, and Tim. So a big thank you to you guys, and if you also support me on Patreon, buy me a coffee or you just use my affiliates links, and it's the kind-hearted people such as yourselves that allow me to fund the kits and tools required to build these conversions. I've also added some merch to my Patreon tiers as well, so make sure you check those out. And so until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.